Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it is a real pleasure to be able to stand in the House today to give my views on Bill C-35 on behalf of the wonderful constituents of Cowichan, Malahat, Langford. Of course, for their benefit, Madam Speaker, we're talking about the Canada Early Learning and Childcare Act. This bill does a few things. I'll just briefly go over them. Setting out the vision for a national early learning childcare system, establishing those principles that are going to guide federal investments in that system. That particular part of the bill is extremely important because I've heard conservative colleagues talk tonight about how asking the question, why is this bill even necessary, given that all of the agreements have already been entered into between provincial governments and the federal government. Well, Madam Speaker, I think it's really important to enshrine those agreements in legislation so that we can avoid future policy lurch where maybe a different government in the future decides to take us into a different direction, because this is an issue that is so fundamentally important that I believe that those funding agreements need to have the force of legislation to back them up, so that not only current generations of young families, but also future generations can also enjoy those benefits. Another commitment is the long-term federal funding for childcare services provided to provinces, but also to Indigenous organizations, and of course the establishment of a National Advisory Council on Early Learning and Childcare, which allows that organization to be set up and to really deliberate on the progress that has been made, to advise the government on what else is needed in its policy going forward. And I just want to speak personally here for a little bit. I'm the father of 3 wonderful daughters. I have almost 11-year-old twins and a 5-year-old. And my twins were born in 2012. It was before I assumed elected office. And I can remember during those first 3 years of their life, my wife and I were both working. We did depend on childcare. We also depended on my parents at times, but it's not easy. And I can remember when I first decided to run for office, Madam Speaker, back in 2015, childcare was a huge election issue in 2015. For the NDP, we ran on a platform of trying to deliver $15 a day childcare. And I can remember, particularly down in the city of Langford, which is the southern part of my riding, the great big southern metropolis of Langford, as I like to call it, because it is one of the fastest growing communities in all of British Columbia. But time and time again, in the 2015 election, when I was out knocking on doors, more often than not, the person who would answer to the door was a young child who would then scream to their mom or dad to come to the door because a stranger was there. But it just really showed that the demographics of the city of Langford, and indeed much of my riding, consisted of young families who were struggling to make it by. And a lot of the feedback I received on the doors of 2015 was that, both parents, in many houses there was a willingness for both parents to go out and work. But what I heard time and time again was the fact that it was simply not worth it for them to do that, because the childcare costs, let alone the availability, but the costs of childcare completely negated any economic advantage that family would get by working 2 jobs. And so often you would have usually the mother telling me, it's just not worth it. I mean, why would I just put my child in childcare when all of the money I would earn from a second job would be going to pay for that? It's better if I just stay at home because at least my child is with her parent or his parent. So enshrining this in legislation, following up with those agreements, these are things that New Democrats have fought long and hard for. It's something I have been proud to run under since I was first elected to this place, and it's nice to see that our House of Commons is coming together to deliver this. This is not just one party that is the author of this. This idea has its beginnings many, many, many years ago. And I'm really proud to be able to stand in this place on behalf of the constituents of Cowichan, Malahat, Langford, and show them that we are actually putting into place legislation which is going to enshrine something that is incredibly important. So absolutely, when it does come to Bill C-35, New Democrats are proudly standing here in support. And I also want to recognize in the past, former members of Parliament of the NDP caucus, in particularly former MP Irene Matheson, whose daughter, of course, is serving right now as the member for London Fanshawe, and former MP Olivia Chow, who, of course, is now running to become the next mayor of Toronto, and I wish her all the best in that. Both of those exceptional members of Parliament, former MPs of this place, did try with legislative initiatives to bring something into this place similar to what C-35 is trying to do. And I also want to underline the confidence and supply agreement that our party has with the Liberals, because if you read Section 2 of that agreement, Madam Speaker, and I'll quote it, one of the main bullet points reads as follows: through introducing an Early Learning and Childcare Act by the end of 2022, ensuring that childcare agreements have long-term protected funding that prioritizes non-profit and public spaces to deliver high-quality, affordable childcare opportunities for families. So this is a very clear example where the CASA, the Confidence and Supply Agreement, is us as a small party working with the government to bring something in that is going to be for the common good. This is a key provision of that agreement, meaning, Madam Speaker, if it had not been met, the agreement would be null and void. And it's a great example of us working together to bring something that is obviously going to benefit so many families right across this country. And I do want to say that, if it were not for New Democrats, many initiatives such as this would not be seeing their rapid pace of adoption in the House as we are seeing now today. I also want to talk a little bit about the history because, of course, we have had strange bedfellows fighting for childcare. We've had major representatives from both Labour and business making the case for childcare. I mean, if you look at some of the comments from Canadian Chambers of Commerce, all the way from the national organization to their provincial counterparts to chambers of commerce of local districts and municipalities, those all realize the benefits that childcare brings to small businesses because, of course, their most valuable resource is their employees. And when they're in danger of losing an employee because of a birth of a child, that can drastically affect small business. And that's why you have seen chambers be some of the most vocal proponents of putting in place this system. At the same time, the labor movement, often at odds with the chamber, couldn't agree more. In fact, we've got a comment here from Beatrice Brusk, the current president of the Canadian Labour Congress, who has said that ensuring affordable, high-quality, accessible, and flexible services means we will have a Canada-wide system of early learning and childcare that meets the needs of workers and families. I do want to, in the conclusion of my speech, Madam Speaker, recognize my fantastic colleague, the NDP member for Winnipeg Centre, for her work. She worked very hard at committee with members of the government to bring forward some constructive amendments, and I'm very pleased to see how many of those amendments were adopted, incorporated in this bill to make it stronger and to make it into the version that we are debating today. So in conclusion, in my last minute, Madam Speaker, I do want to recognize that, again, we would not be here today if it were not for the work of many different people over many different years. I want to particularly thank all the childcare advocates and unions who have fought to make this legislation a reality. I want to give special recognition to parents and families, particularly those in my riding, who have kept up the pressure, kept up the advocacy, and kept on pressuring members of Parliament right across Canada to bring in the change that we are seeing through C-35. And I also finally want to recognize women because we know that a national system of affordable childcare helps advance gender equality, and that is an important reason for us alone by itself. So thank you. With that, Madam Speaker, I welcome any questions and comments my colleagues may have.
And comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Tourism and to the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. He put a lot of emphasis on thanking those people who have helped get to our government to this point, and I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that Paul Martin had proposed a national daycare strategy. Unfortunately, that Parliament was dissolved by the opposition and an election was called, which prevented us from moving ahead with it, but it was in our platform, and it was an important promise that we made to Canadians that has been delivered today. I wonder if my colleague, in his closing, he acknowledged that this is an important step for women's equality. If he would like to comment on the fact that we are now at 85% of women in their working years who are in the labour force, thanks in part to this policy, and if he is seeing that change in the demographic workers in his own riding, in his community.
The Honourable Member for Cowichan Malahat Langford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just a quick comment on the opening statement from my colleague. I mean, I've heard Liberals mention what happened in 2005, 2006. What they failed to mention, of course, is the fact that the Liberals did enjoy majority government in 1993, 1997, and the year 2000. But I digress. I will agree with my colleague. I am absolutely seeing the results in Cowichan Malahat Langford through hard work of many different advocates, of pressuring members of Parliament to bring us to this part. I am very glad to live in a province that is governed by an NDP government, which sees value in putting families first, in making sure that they have resources to thrive economically. And I'm glad to see that our provincial NDP government has been working with the federal government and, of course, partnering with us, the federal NDP, to push the Liberals to this point so that we can make life for British Columbians better, and especially members in my home community of Cowichan Malahat Langford.
Questions and comments? The Honourable for Peterborough Kawartha.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for his intervention. And I appreciate, how he's advocating for the people who do have access to these spaces. But I think what the alarm bells are, and what we're really trying to get across here tonight, is those that don't have access. And so we have these reports coming out. Childcare spots available for only 29% of those who need it, which is by the Childcare Resources and Research Unit. But in particular to his riding, 64% in British Columbia, 64% of children are in a childcare desert. So that means 3 children are competing for 1 spot. Has he reached out to these families? Has he listened to these families? And what is his solution on increasing access?
I remember Cowichan Malahat Langford.
Well, Madam Speaker, I will not disagree with my colleague. There's absolutely a lot more work that is done. If anyone thinks that we're going to suddenly dust our hands off after the passage of C-35 and say all is done, that is simply beyond any reasonable thought. I don't see C-35 as being in opposition to that fact on the ground. In fact, I think the passage of this bill enshrining in legislation the federal government's commitment to this funding formula is precisely the kind of action this Parliament needs to demonstrate, the leadership this Parliament needs to demonstrate in addressing the problem that my colleague brought up. So I will agree with her. There is a lot more work that needs to be done. It's my hope that through C-35 we're actually going to pressure the federal government to follow through with those agreements with the provinces, and it's great that we'll have an advisory council that will keep the government honest and transparent on that.
We have time for a brief question. The Honourable Member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
My honourable friend from Cowichan Malahat Langford, and I do know what a dedicated father he is. How would he reflect on the availability of early learning and childcare on Vancouver Island, particularly in the kinds of areas where we both work and live?
Answer from the member for Cowichan Malahat Langford.
Yeah, I mean, I can not only reflect on my personal experiences before I became an elected member of Parliament. I had 3 years with my twin daughters. But, I have spoken with many members of my community. I referenced knocking on doors in 2015. Those conversations have not stopped since 2015. I've been proud to meet with many constituents in my time as their elected representative here in Ottawa. And what those conversations have demonstrated to me is that there is a continued need. They need their members of parliament to stay focused on this issue, to force this government to follow through on those funding arrangements through legislative initiatives like C-35. Thank you very much.
Nice. Resuming